All right, we are back here on the podcast. You just heard the trailer for HBO Sports documentary, The Day Sports Stood Still. Joining me today to talk about this interesting choice of documentary is the guy who has talked about some pop culture stuff with some fantasy baseball coverage last week, Fallon Austin. Alan's back. How are you?
I'm good, Mike. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Doing pretty good. I have to say, this was certainly an interesting documentary out of HBO.
Absolutely. I really thought it was important. I thought it was well put together. I think with, using all the technology we have now in today's culture, they were able to make a film that both represented the story it was telling and the means in which people are getting stuff done now. The Zoom interviews and just, any means necessary to tell a story with what's going on in the world.
Yeah, they get a ton of credit for me from that because I watched the 30 for 30, which was filmed during the pandemic or around the Super Bowl with Al Davis, the NFL. They used no original interviews. They only went with archival, and they did these really weird deep fakes where they had actors pretending to be like Al Davis and Pete Rozelle and just CGI their faces onto the actual actors, which was really creepy. This was much better done.
Oh, man. Yeah. And you know what? I know it's not. It's kind of, I think, what you're saying, what they've done sometimes. I know The Irishman did it. I know the Marvel movies have done it where they kind of CGI actors to look younger. And it always looks odd to me. Always. It never looks clean or crisp.
Yeah, and that one they were basically the only original voices talking in this. So that looked very strange. This one was obviously I'd rather have interviews over Zoom than that.
Absolutely. Because you know what? I think for the most part, an educated viewer understands. You know what I mean? Like, and especially for a story like this, which is showcasing the pandemic in a way, you got to be able to like understand that it's not going to be as artistic, but the information's still getting across.
Yeah, it feels like a product of the times. It makes more sense. And speaking of the times, I mean, it's hard to believe we're over a year from the day that sports did stand still on March 11th, 2020. Like, what do you remember about that day specifically?
What I remember is that there was this kind of cloud creeping over sports prior to there. In this film, they kind of go into it, but I remember it being a little bit more of a fear than this film lets on. In fact, in terms of is stuff going to end? And I remember watching a wrestling event for All Elite Wrestling. It was in Utah, like a couple days prior. And I remember just having this feeling of what's going to happen if more people get sick. And then what I remember specifically about the beginning of this whole thing was obviously the Jazz Thunder, but it was also Rudy Gobert touching all the microphones and being very loosey-goosey afterwards. So the day itself, I remember thinking, oh my goodness. And then I remember the Gobert touching all the microphones. And I just remember being like, I think everyone's taking this a little too lightly. So that was my general feel during that day. But I definitely remember the sports world freaking out over the cancellations and that being the real wake-up call for people. But I do think that the wake-up call started a little bit earlier, and I think you could attest to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, from personal experience, I mean, I remember that time that all the lead up to, and we had stuff like the MLB deciding to ban clubhouse access, and I remember there was an op-ed Ken Rosenthal, I think, wrote in The Athletic about how it's important for the writers to have their access to the clubhouse. We had John Heyman making jokes about how the Pirates are the most COVID-prepared organization in baseball, and then all that stuff sort of like a light deal of it. I remember I was in Atlantic City, like covering the MAC tournament down there, and we were down there. They announced early in the day there was going to be no fans the rest of the tournament because that was the whole thing. It was like, oh, we're going to play the sports without any fans. And then I'm sitting there in the arena when we had the news about Tom Hanks breaking, we getting the COVID, and then we have Rudy Gobert getting, and then the bomb from Woj, the NBA suspending the season. And everybody's sort of sitting there like, what's going to happen now? It's like that's sort of like the bomb that's everything else off.
And, being that you and I have spent a lot of time at Iona College, there was a time prior to March 11th where a fellow student and I were covering a basketball game for the department. And we were kind of freaking out because there was a case in New Rochelle at the time. And this is when it first started trickling into U.S. soil and putting a little fear into especially people in New Rochelle. And we were like, this is getting scary. And we were there covering a game as if nothing was happening. So the thoughts may have been there for me earlier because of something like that.
Yeah, that's also certainly a fair point. I mean, I also am going to point people back to the first podcast I did after the sports world shut down last year. I spoke with Troy Moriel, who I've been doing the March Madness coverage with this year. I mean, he was at the Garden last year when the Big East tournament shut down. The way he described that scene was just so surreal.
Absolutely. And this film itself does a pretty good job at capturing just the sudden stop of it all.
Yeah, that they do. And I think let's get deeper into this film because, I mean, I think they do a good job right off the bat giving you this opening montage where they give you all these moments of the crowd getting hyped at big sporting events and then just the complete drop to all the sound gone, the shots of the empty stands. That did a good job setting the mood to get you into what you're getting into here.
It felt like an apocalypse movie. It felt like a scene from I Am Legend or something like that where it's just nothing. And it was very effective.
It was tremendously effective. And I do think, obviously, we had to start with the Jazz Thunder thing. And this thing is centered around basically Chris Paul. He's an EP on the project. He was obviously there in the arena when all the craziness started. I thought it was cool to see his recollection of the thing combined with the use of their archival footage, including, I think, previously unreleased footage from inside the arena where he's talking about what players are like shouting to each other, and you see them lip syncing it to Chris Paul actually saying it in real time. That was a very, very creepy thing.
It was creepy, and I do like the Chris Paul aspect because clearly he's a big deal within the league. You know, yes, he was a superstar at one time. He's no longer a superstar on the court, but off the court and in the public eye, he is still a superstar. So to have his name and his presence and his voice there as kind of like the narrator almost, but not quite, I think it was very effective, and he clearly knows how to be in front of a camera. He knows how to tell a story, and it read very well.
Yeah, I mean, that whole scene was just bonkers. I remember they're talking about like how like they didn't know who was doing what. They talk about how like guys in the Jazz locker were sort of joking around like, oh, like I hope I don't have it, like sort of like half joking, like half afraid, like that kind of inside stuff we haven't really heard before.
Absolutely, and having Donovan Mitchell there was big because I remember after Gobert, Mitchell was the next big name to be revealed, and the Jazz were getting hit hard, and it was becoming all the more nobody is invincible feel. So to have Mitchell there talking about his experience in his living room, just camped out for a couple weeks playing video games. I mean, I know it doesn't sound like, it didn't seem like he was affected by the virus in any everlasting way, but his experience was a real eye-opener at the time, and I'm glad we got to see and hear his side of the story as well.
Yeah, his was good. We got to see some of the other athletes from other sports who were affected, like the Olympic fencer who was trying to train, had the rug pulled out from under him. Also, it was interesting with Chris Paul, see like his move from going back from Oklahoma City back to his home in Los Angeles and seeing that I'm getting the test results on Sunday. Monday comes, he's not there. Tuesday comes, he's home, but he's staying in his car because he still hasn't gotten his results yet, and he doesn't let his kids know he's home. Like that made it even more real.
And that put it shows you how far we've come in a year. Because right now, if that same thing happened with all the info we have, he would let his family know. He would go in his house and just stay in a separate room. His wife would probably help try to take care of him. There would be like better, an understanding. But this was back then when we didn't know anything about it. We were so confused. It seemed so deadly, which it is. But there was just so much more uncertainty that there is now. So it makes sense that he waited in his car for a couple of days. It was that kind of panic and mystery around COVID at the time.
Yeah, it was even more even crazier when he finally gets his test result and you see his son just dead stopped because he doesn't know if his dad has the virus or not. So that was also something that was like very jarring.
Very jarring, very effective, and very honest. That's how we all have been. Well, most of us, have been during this pandemic. Very tentative, very unsure, and quite honestly, pretty scared.
Yeah, I think the doc did a very good job on this. I think the documentary also did a very good job covering the role that Black Lives Matter sort of developed as the George Floyd murder happened and all these other events happened around the country to bring about the conversation on racial unrest. And I think it's a good job having these conversations, showing what the athletes were doing here. And it's something I think people always forget that, like, I think without sports and without all the distractions, like, these conversations would not have been as big as they became.
Absolutely. And they mention it several times throughout the film that all this social justice threw a curveball into their planning of the story. And it was something they had to address and they had to put it in there. And you're right. This summer of 2020, when there was no sports, was a real time for social reflection and what was going on in the world, all the injustice. And it needs to be called out. It needs to continually be called out. And conversations like that, you are 100% correct, may not have happened or been addressed yet had the sports world not stood still.
Not even just sports. Like, there was no movies, there was no TV, there was no
very true
anything.
Yeah.
There's no entertainment complex going on, and without all those distractions, now people just can't really ignore what was happening in Minnesota.
Right, you're absolutely right. Because if all the sports went on strike, people would fill their time with other activities. There was nothing to do.
It really was nothing to do, and I did think, in my opinion, the best aspect of this documentary was the focus on the NBA specific stuff, which I get because Chris Paul's in the NBA. There were a lot of NBA guys he was connected to. I think that was by far the most effective stuff in the film.
Absolutely. And you know what? This country has a long way to go, but it's better we're having these discussions than not. I think, peppering in other sports athletes in COVID and social justice is important. I think we could have fleshed it out a little bit more and rounded out some of the stories a little bit better. But I think that when you're given all this material and you have an hour 40 or an hour 30, whatever this film was, you have a lot to pack in. You really don't want to leave anything on the cutting room floor, but you also want to leave time to explore and flesh out more stories. Like, they touch on Mookie Betts and baseball, but they don't really dig deep on it. They go to the fencing guy. I can't remember his name at the moment, but they touch on different sports and gymnastics, but they don't really do a deep dive. They just kind of do surface level. And, I'm actually intrigued. I want to hear more. I want to see how their stories round out. I think it scratched the surface. This may have been able to be a two-parter.
I think it could have been. I mean, they get 2 parts on Tiger Woods. It's surprised not do 2 parts on this.
And you know what? A two-parter here, you could do an hour and a half to 2 hours on COVID specific, and then an hour and a half to 2 hours on social justice or social injustices specific, and really get a complete 4-hour project that, really, really breaks down and gets into the sports world as a whole. Yes, you're going to be able to cover, Chris Paul and the NBA a good amount, but you're also going to dig deeper on the other sports which they touched on. And you might be able to delay the release a little bit so that COVID's on its way out even more, and we can have even more of a reflective look on some of these things rather than we're still kind of not out of the woods yet. We're still in the thick of it, looking back on it. So I think if I were to make 2 changes, it would be flesh it out into a 2-parter and maybe release it later on.
I think that second point's dead on. I think, honestly, like, it's sort of the same thing we had with the Craig Carton documentary, where we saw Craig's rise, saw his downfall. Then we didn't get the part of the documentary where Craig is back at WFAN with Evan Roberts. We don't see any of that. We just end up with the little title card saying Craig has negotiated a radio return. I think if we have this set released in March of 2022, maybe drop it on 3/11/22, because by then you figure everything is pretty much back to normal. Then you have, I think, a more complete picture, as opposed to here it feels like we're stopping about 3/4 of the way through the actual story.
Yeah, whatever the new normal is. But of course, it's the same thing as Carton. You're right. Like, how much more effective would the Carton thing be now that he's gotten in a groove with Evan Roberts? His ratings are through the roof. That's the redemption, not just negotiating a new deal. I get the fact, content was sparse. It was like non-existent. People wanted stuff to be released during the pandemic, but I think it sacrifices the overall message of the piece if we're just releasing, as soon as possible rather than waiting for the story to unfold completely.
Yeah, because I feel like the story they kind of clip it in late August, basically after Chris Paul leaves the bubble, sort of where we end this, and so we get the little title card saying, "Oh, the NFL had this many players test positive. The NBA's had this many test positive, and they're not in the bubble this year." I think sort of continue, like maybe even like a sequel setup, say, okay, like in March of 2022, here's where we continue. I think that would have been more effective than what we got.
And maybe we'll get that. Maybe we'll get a Sports Stood Still Part 2 at a later date. I just think, I would have waited as we discussed. And I just want to point out that the film we have, I really enjoyed it. It was a fast watch. I was intrigued the whole time. Antoine Fuqua is a phenomenal director, made his mark with Training Day back in the day. High quality individuals putting together this piece, and it really shows. So I think our, critiques are more because we were into it as opposed to we discredited and didn't like it. We wanted to see more. We wanted to see, I guess, I just wanted to see it flushed out a little bit more because I really liked what we got.
Yeah, I also think there's a story here if you just focused on the NBA stuff. Because, I get that you have to mention that March Madness was canceled and that everything else got pushed back. But I think the NBA has sort of been the one that's been the front and center in terms of everything coming back. Because they're the ones that had the bubble that got everybody's attention. They're the ones that had the biggest role in the social justice movement. This is one thing I was a little disappointed. We did not get more on the story behind the protest in the bubble where Milwaukee boycotted the game. And then we had the talks about maybe the season would shut down. I thought it would have been interesting. I don't know how many people would have been willing to talk about this meeting, with the fact that they had a meeting in the bubble that was not really addressed in the film, where we had discussion that maybe everybody's going to pack up and go home and just leave the season behind. I thought it was interesting to get a little bit more on that.
Yeah, and I think, again, a two-parter where you can do 2 hours on the social justice and that side of the story, you get to be able to do that. They do touch on it here, but you're right. I wanted to see more of that because that is so powerful. That is real change in the making. That is real discussion from human beings trying to make a better world for everybody. And it could have easily been, elongated in this story.
I think it could have. I do think, though, I'm going to give it a solid B+. I think the only thing that holds it back is that I think it could have been so much better than it was, but it's still a very good watch.
Yeah, a B+ is a solid grade. It's a fair one. I think what would have put it in the A range would have been a little more time and a little bit more what happened after as part of the story and not just footnotes at the end.
Yeah, because I think there was stuff going on throughout the NFL season that was interesting. You had further stuff in the NBA. I think there was more there, and hopefully maybe Chris Paul and Antoine Fuqua revisit this and say, maybe in a year we talk more on this and get more in-person interviews as conditions become more normal. I think that would be a fun follow-up.
For sure. And I do want to say another really effective piece here was the Karl Anthony Towns stuff. That was completely sobering. That was a reminder that this is very serious. And even though, there seems to be a light at the end of the tunnel, a lot of people have died. A lot of people have been affected. And it's just been a miserable experience for all. And we shouldn't ever take what we have for granted. And I thought that was a really nice touch. And for him to sit there on that Instagram video, I believe it was an Instagram video, and just kind of address the public, real emotional stuff, really effective. And this film, I would say it is a must watch just for the messages, it has to tell you. I think it's very informative, and I think it's very important.
Yeah, I think also one thing I think that may hurt this a bit is also I think some people may be, as you see in the country, people trying to get back to their lives. I think people are still going through COVID fatigue right now. I wonder how people are going to say it and say, do I want to go back to what it was a year ago yet? I think maybe people will further they may be more interested in a project like this.
I could see that, but I would tell them that it's too important to miss. That would be my answer to that. There's too much to look back and remember that this happened in 2020. It's still happening today. It will happen forever in the for social justice. That fight will never end. In one way, shape, or form, it will never end. So to get more information, to learn more stories like this, it's vital to the human experience. So I would say, yes, I understand you may be a little fatigued from all COVID-related content, but that's the new reality, and we need to learn from it, and we need to go forward with more information, more acceptance, and more compassion.
I would agree with that as well, because it's not, let's say, NCIS saying, oh, we're going to the characters wear masks sometimes because our setting takes place in COVID. It's not like that, where I just kind of feel like sometimes these shows shoehorning into their stories to sort of feel real with the times. This actually is a reflection of reality.
Right. Yeah. This is not ripped from the headlines, Law and Order style. This is real life. Obviously, Law and Order implies that it's a real life story, but it's not fiction. This is nonfiction. This is real life. Like you said, this is an important film.
I think it is too. Now, before I let you go, what else have you been streaming of late? Because I feel like there's some stuff that's been popping out, people I'm keeping an eye on.
You know what, Mike? I gotta be honest with you. Some of what I've been streaming lately has been older stuff. My fiance and I, we finished a rewatch of The Sopranos. So, and she likes it, but I was like, you know what? Let's watch a show you loved as well. And we sat and streamed the entire run of Sex and the City, which I know is probably the biggest curveball I could have thrown at you right now. But since that show itself is on its way back, it was interesting to go back and see what that show was for the time and how it still holds up today. So that, in all honesty, the last show I streamed was Sex and the City, but I don't want to leave without reminding you, and I've reminded you off the air many times, please watch Brockmire.
Yeah, that one's on my list. The most recent thing I streamed was I actually checked out the Snyder Cut last week.
Now, believe it or not, the Snyder Cut release and the trailer for the new Suicide Squad have kind of pushed me to going back and revisiting all the Marvel stuff I've missed. So another thing I have streamed recently is the first Ant-Man. So I watched recently the first Ant-Man, and I loved it. I thought it was a lot of fun and a great little film, and it was a very good contrast to some of the other films in the Marvel universe.
Yeah, I remember the Ant-Man was fun. I will say that. I'm also going to be doing the Snyder Cut on the podcast next week. My buddy Nick Frietta is checking it out because Nick actually has a unique perspective because I was most of the traditional where I watched the Justice League, the one that Zack Snyder started and had to step away from Joss Whedon finished in theaters. I watched that and I watched the Snyder Cut last week. Nick actually watched Snyder Cut first. He's going back to watch Justice League, so he's going to give me that perspective, what seeing the original intended vision compared to what it actually became. That's going to be a fun conversation.
Wow. And let me ask you, without spoiling what you're going to talk about, is there a big difference between the two? And a follow-up is, after they announced they were going to release the Snyder Cut, how much had to be refilmed, reshot, and what did Zack Snyder do after the fact?
Oh, there's a very big difference. I mean, obviously, the fact it's double the length because the Justice League was 2 hours, Snyder Cut is 4. But, the story in Snyder Cut is much more complete than what we got in the Justice League film version. And I think also the problem they had here is that there's a total mismatch between what Zack Snyder wanted to do when Joss Whedon ended up doing. Granted, part of it came from mandates from DC themselves saying, hey, keep it to 2 hours in the theater and, try and lighten the tone up a little bit. But I think the Snyder Cut, we'll get into this next week more, but there are things that Snyder did well. There are also things that you could see why there were issues with what DC was trying to do here.
Interesting. And did he have to go back and film new content after it was announced?
He did. He had some. I remember I saw that Henry Cavill, Ezra Miller, Ray Fisher, a couple other actors went back and filmed new stuff at the end of last year, so it fell in the gaps of that story.
Did the Jared Leto scene get filmed after the fact?
I believe that was filmed after the fact.
Interesting. There's so many. I've had a lot of trouble, Mike, and maybe you could point me to the right direction online of exactly what belongs in the MCU and what belongs in the DC version of the DCU. I don't know what it's called, but if I'm going to invest the time, I want to know every piece of content that is part of these universes and the order that they should be watched, because otherwise it's just, I feel lost.
Yeah, Marvel is easier because Marvel is pretty clear. It's okay, the movies are here. Now it's the Disney Plus shows, the important things. There's ancillary stuff like the Netflix material. They said was in there, but I don't know if they still count it right now, so I would steer you clear of that. But the movies on Marvel is clear. DC, it's basically, it's a little messy right now because they're trying to decide what direction they want to take it in. But, the official films, I can point you to, which ones those are.
Okay, and with the MCU series, you mentioned the Netflix ones. I've actually been told, I don't know if this is true or if this was that person's opinion, that the one series that truly belongs in the MCU is Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.
Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. does, they actually did tie it in well in the first two movies, and of course sort of phased themselves out of it because there was a divide between the old Marvel TV brand and the Marvel Films brand, because there was sort of this is not developed by Kevin Feige, and he sort of like did not want to give the TV show access to stuff. They tell good stories, which are kind of, I want to say, like, they're canon until they're not, where like they have like you can ignore it and it still can be in the canon, but until they specifically like rewrite something or bring somebody in with a new backstory, it's not officially canon yet.
So to play it safe, none of the Netflix shows are Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. I should reference as part of the MCU in my overall umbrella of understanding.
That would be correct, because I mean, the only, like, I'm going to keep an eye out on the Netflix one because I know there's rumors that Daredevil is going to pop up in Spider-Man 3 to Spider-Man No Way Home. If he does pop up...
And this would be the Daredevil from the Netflix series.
Yeah, there are rumors that the Daredevil played by Charlie Cox would show up.
So that would change things.
That would change it, because that would be them actually acknowledging that those series existed, because at the moment they have not.
Okay, and I think at that point, if Daredevil exists, all the others exist. You know, I think that would be safe to say. Although I've heard that Iron Fist is terrible.
Iron Fist is garbage.
Fair enough. So I think I've got a better understanding than coming into this conversation now.
Yeah, because like that and any of the shows on Disney Plus right now are considered basically on par with the movie. So like WandaVision, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, those are on par with movies in terms of where they fit in the Marvel universe.
Right, and they're going to be. Are they all going to be one season like series? Are they all going to be limited series, or are any of them going to extend?
There's supposed to be a couple that are going more than one. I think Loki's supposed to be get a second season. I know the animated What If is supposed to get a second season. I don't know about any of the other ones yet, but I would not be surprised if some of them have more than one season.
And my last question. Sorry, I've got two more.
Yeah.
Does MCU Phase 4, does that take into consideration everything that came before, or are they kind of starting a new story?
This picks up basically after the events of Endgame.
And it starts with Far From Home?
Far From Home is the official end of Phase 3.
Oh, so Phase 4 has not started yet.
Well, WandaVision technically is the start of Phase 4.
Gotcha. And Black Widow will be a part of Phase 4.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay. I'm starting to learn here, Mike. It's very complicated to a non-fan, so to speak, to get caught up, especially when it's been embedded for years. But my last question is, Margot Robbie plays Harley Quinn. Are all of her Harley Quinn performances connected in the same universe?
I think so. I have not seen her second movie yet, so I can't officially confirm that or not. I have to actually watch that movie and get back to you on that one.
And this is Birds of Prey?
I've not seen Birds of Prey. I saw the original Suicide Squad, which is hot garbage, but...
Gotcha. All right, Mike, I won't take up any more of your time on this. Day of the Sports stood still. Please go watch it and get informed and learn something.
Yeah, the DC stuff is a bit messy. I will say that. And like a lot of the films are not that good, but hopefully, you know, they're starting to get their act together.
I've heard that the best film in that whole run is none of them, but the best performance is Ben Affleck in Batman v Superman. I've always heard that movie's kind of bad, but he's really good.
The movie is too long. I think the best movie of the bunch is still the original Wonder Woman movie.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I have heard good things. I've seen Wonder Woman 84. I did not like it.
That one sucked.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but we'll have a DC conversation another time. Before I let you go, how can you follow social media? Keep on some of the stuff you're up to?
Absolutely. So at Alan_Austin_ on Twitter, at Alan Austin Sports on Instagram, and you can listen to myself and my partner Ben's podcast, American Scene. We cover films that have American in the title and look at their cultural impact and what they say about America as a whole. That is American Scene Pod on Instagram. Check us out. Follow us. Give us a listen. Let us know what you think.
Also, this podcast is coming out on opening day today. So who's your random baseball player for opening day?
Ooh, random baseball player for opening day. You want him to be current or all time?
It could be either. Like, who would you put up on Twitter today as the current, like, all time, as your current random baseball player?
Okay, so if opening day was today, you know what? I'm a guest on your podcast. I'd make it a Met. I would put up Benny Agbayani.
That's funny. That was the name I was thinking of, too.
Oh, wow. Well, there you go.
All right. So
Random Mets player for opening day.
Benny Agbayani. You'll see him on Twitter on Thursday when this podcast is in your ears. Alan, thanks again.
Thank you, Mike.